feel rather like the man, you know, met a friend, hadn't seen him for a very, very long time. He said, "How's your wife?" He said, "She's gone to heaven." He said, "I'm sorry." Then he realized that wasn't the right thing to say. He said, "I'm glad." And then he realized that wasn't the right thing to say either. He said, "I'm surprised." Well, I was surprised, and I'm sure glad I got that off my chest. Let's turn, please, to Matthew chapter 23. I want to speak to you for a little while tonight about the second coming of Christ. I was out in Oklahoma City in September of this year when the Lord was supposed to come. There's a friend of mine in Florida, I won't tell you where, and she's the secretary for a church I speak at sometimes, and I usually give them a couple of Sundays a year. And she phoned me up about March or April of last year, and she said, "Can you come before September?" I said, "No, I don't think so. I booked to be with you in November. I can't." She said, "We want you to come before September." I said, "Why do you want me to come before September?" Well, she said, "The Lord's coming." Well, I said, "Hallelujah, I believe that, but what's that got to do with September?" Well, she said, "It's the Feast of Trumpets." Well, I said, "What's that got to do with it?" Well, she said, "The Lord's coming on the Feast of Trumpets, and we want you to come before that. We want you to come before September." Well, I tried to get some sense into the lady's head, but it didn't do very much good, and I went in November anyway. Matter of fact, just after the big day that didn't happen, I called her up. I said, "Hey, how come you missed the rapture?" Matthew chapter 23. Verse 32, "Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you generation of vipers. How can you escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. From the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias the son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar." Now that's a very important statement. We miss it in our ordinary reading. Doesn't mean very much to us. Would have meant a lot to the Jews of Jesus' day. You see, if you look at a Jewish Bible, you'll see that they've got the same books in their Bible that we have in our Old Testament, but they're not in the same order. The last book in the Jewish Bible isn't Malachi, although it's in there. The last book is the book of Chronicles. And that's what gives point to this statement, because the first martyr in the Jewish Bible was Abel, and the last martyr in the Jewish Bible was Zacharias, the son of Barachias. So you see, what Jesus was saying was simply this. He was saying to these people who were about to murder their Messiah, he was saying, the crime you are about to commit is so horrendous a crime in the sight of God that if God were to take all the righteous blood ever shed upon the earth, all the martyrs and all the murders and all the massacres of the Old Testament, and heap all that blood on your head, you'd be less guilty than you are now. And then he said this, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." The next verse, he described the destruction of Jerusalem, one of the most terrible events in recorded history. The Jews so exasperated the Romans by the stubborn defense of their city that every time the Romans caught a Jew, they crucified him until the hills around the city were black with crosses, and on every cross a Jew. And when they took the city, they massacred 1 million people and deported so many Jews that they gutted the slave markets and the arenas of the Roman world. Jesus said these things will come upon this generation. It was a literal generation. There were people still living when it happened. Jesus said all these things are going to begin to be, and this generation's going to see it. It was a literal generation. The expression occurs about 16 times in the Gospels, another 9 times with an adjective such as a wicked generation, an evil generation, an adulterous generation. It refers to a literal generation. Now look at chapter 24. Verse 32, learn a parable of the fig tree. When its branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation, same expression, means the same thing. If it was a literal expression in chapter 23, it's very difficult to see how it can be anything else in chapter 24. In fact, he uses almost the same words. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Or as some translate that, till all these things begin to be. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. In other words, we can't set a date for the rapture. It's no use saying that because Israel became a state in 1948, the generation is 40 years, therefore the Lord's got to come in 1988. Obviously, that ain't so. Pardon my American. We don't know how long a generation is. And we don't know exactly when God starts to count anyway. But we do know that we are mighty near the end. The Lord says, when you see the leaves on the trees in the springtime, you know perfectly well that summer's just around the corner. When you see these things begin to be, that's the sign I'm coming back. And I believe these things are beginning to be. Learn, he says, the parable of the fig tree. There are 3 trees in the Bible that symbolize the nation of Israel. There is the fig and the olive and the vine. The vine tree represents the nation of Israel as it was in the Old Testament, from the time it became a nation, right down until the time the nation rejected Christ. You remember the parable of the vineyard, how the Lord Jesus told of God taking this vine tree and planting it and protecting it and hiring it out to husbandmen. And how down through the long centuries of the Old Testament he sent people looking for a return upon his investment. And some they murdered and some they mauled. And last of all he sent his son, and him they put to death. That's the vineyard, you see. The vine, Israel, down to the time the nation rejected Christ. And then in the upper room, just a little while afterwards, he gathered the disciples around him. He said, now men, he said, it's different now. From now on, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. That's the vine. The olive represents the nation of Israel as it will be in a coming day after the nation finally accepts Christ. Remember in Romans chapter 11, Paul is talking about Jews and Gentiles in the purpose of God. That chapter has nothing primarily to do with the church. He says, I speak to you Gentiles. He's talking about the fact that Gentiles have come into a place of religious privilege that once belonged solely to a Jew. And that is true. You see, for 2,000 years, if God had anything to say, he said it in Hebrew. For 2,000 years, if God had anything to say, he spoke to a Jew. But after Calvary and after Pentecost, if God had anything to say, he said it in Greek. He began to speak a Gentile language. And Paul, writing to the Roman Christians, he says, now I want you to understand that for centuries the Jew occupied a very unique position in relation to God, a position of religious privilege. But he said, God has taken the natural branches and he's broken them off. And he's taken you wild olive branches and he's grafted you in. And you have that place of privilege today that once belonged to a Jew. Now he says, you Gentiles, don't you boast, because you today have that place of privilege. Because he said one of these days God is going to take the natural branches that have been broken off the Jewish people. He's going to graft them back in again. And oh, he said, if the breaking off of the natural branches has been such a blessing to the Gentile world, what's it going to be like when he grafts them back in again? Well, we know what it's going to be like. It's going to be the millennium. That's the olive tree. Looking forward to the day when the remnant of the nation of Israel will accept Jesus as Messiah, and all the great and glowing promises and prophecies of the Old Testament will be literally fulfilled down here on planet Earth. Now, in between the time that Israel as the vine rejected Christ and the time when Israel as the olive will finally accept Christ, in between Israel is the fig tree. Now he says, learn the parable of the fig tree. Just the day before, he had given the miracle of the fig tree. Coming into Jerusalem that morning from Bethany, he and his disciples were hungry. They'd got up before breakfast and somehow slipped away before Martha was up and about. And there, standing by the side of the road, was a magnificent fig tree, covered with foliage, every outward indication of being a healthy tree. They went to that tree to get some breakfast, and there was nothing on it at all. It was totally barren, nothing for Jesus. And he did something very extraordinary, something he had never done before. He performed his only judgment miracle, and he cursed that fig tree. When they came back that way that night, they noticed that the tree had withered up and died. It couldn't exist without the blessing of its creator. Now, you see, that was the miracle of the fig tree. Obviously, it was intended to be a parable. Learn, he says, the parable of the fig tree. That literal fig tree standing there by the side of the road that had nothing for Jesus was a picture of the Jewish nation to which he had come, that was utterly barren toward God and had nothing for Christ except a cattle shed in which to be born and a cross upon which to die. And he withdrew his blessing from that nation, as we see in Matthew chapter 23 in those 8 terrible curses of that chapter. And then the fig tree withered up and died. Began in AD 70. It was completed in AD 135. Now he says, you watch that tree, you watch that fig tree. When you see the tree, that tree I've just cursed, when you see Israel coming back to life, that's the sign I'm coming back to earth. Watch the fig tree. And my friends, you and I have lived to see the budding of the fig tree. And when you see the tree putting forth its leaves, oh, you say, spring is here, summer's on the way. The rebirth of the state of Israel simply tells us that Jesus is on the way. That clock that God stopped at Calvary has started to tick again. It won't be long before it's chiming out the hours. Jesus is coming again. I want to talk to you very briefly about three things connected with this. First of all, we are confronted with a very great mystery. And then we are confronted with a very great miracle. And finally, we are confronted with a very great message. Now, here's the mystery. When a people is uprooted and scattered, and its homeland destroyed, that nation disappears. It is known as the law of assimilation. The scattered remnants of the nation finding their homes in other countries are just absorbed into that country, and they disappear as a separate people. That's an observable law of history. And it operates for all people except the Jewish people. Doesn't work for them. When I first came to North America, I was with a large Canadian bank. They sent me across the country to British Columbia, up into the interior. While we were living up in northern British Columbia, we came to know some very fine German Baptist folk. The old people had come out to Canada from Germany right after the First World War, and they'd settled in Canada and had taken out Canadian citizenship, but they were really Germans living in Canada. They spoke the German language, they ate German food, they spoke nostalgically of the fatherland, and of course they wanted to worship God in their native language, so they incorporated a German church and brought over a German pastor. Naturalized Canadians, but really Germans living in Canada, first generation. Now, the second generation were already in the process of assimilation. They were young Canadians. They were bilingual. They spoke German at home, but they really spoke the English language. They went to Canadian schools, absorbed Canadian culture. Their friends were all young Canadians. By the time they were teenagers, they were saying to the old people, why do we have to have all the services in German? Why can't we have some services in English? And so the old people decided that it would be a good idea to do that, to keep their young people, and they sent over to Germany, brought over another pastor who was supposed to be bilingual. And he used to speak to the old people on Sunday morning in High German, and he'd speak to the young people on Sunday night in absolutely appalling English. But you see, the process of assimilation was already underway. The next generation had been totally assimilated. The grandchildren didn't speak any German. And by the time the grandchildren were 5 or 6 years of age, the second generation was saying to the first generation, why do we have to have any services in German? And so they incorporated an English German Baptist church. But you see, this is the law of assimilation. You see it working even more evidently in the United States, which is the melting pot of all nations. People come here from all countries, and within a generation or two, they are absorbed into the American mainstream. Now, of course, you have pockets of culture because the homelands are still there. But nevertheless, the process of assimilation goes on. And by the time you're down about 2 or 3 generations, you don't have the old people anymore. You've got young Americans. But there's something rather interesting about all this. For instance, in the United States, you've got Irish Americans, and you've got German Americans, and you've got Polish Americans, but you don't have any any Jewish Americans. You've got American Jews. Now, why is everybody else an Irish American or a German American or a Polish American, but a Jew is an American Jew? Because that's what he is. He's a Jew. His father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather may have been born in this country, and he may be able to trace his Jewish ancestry back to soon after the Mayflower, but he's still a Jew. And that's not only true in this country, it's true in every country. They got Jews in France, but they're not Jewish Frenchmen, they're French Jews. You got Jews in Russia, but they're not Jewish Russians, they're Russian Jews. So you see, the Jew has remained a Gulf Stream in the ocean of mankind. And he has preserved his national identity not just for 2 or 3 generations, but for 60 generations. And not just in 1 or 2 countries, but in 100 countries. That's a very great mystery. The only explanation of that mystery is God, and the fact that God has a future for this people, as outlined in his word. Now, it's not only a very great mystery, it's also a very great miracle. The Jew cannot be assimilated, but neither can he be exterminated. There have been countless attempts in history to exterminate the Jewish people. In fact, for the past 2,000 years, their history has been one of continuous persecution. There's hardly a country in Europe that at some time or another didn't expel its entire Jewish population. There is in Gentile society a social disease that we call anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jew. Now, anti-Semitism is endemic in all Gentile society. But from time to time it becomes epidemic. And when it becomes epidemic, you have a Holocaust. We just have come through just such an experience in the world. When the German army was finally defeated and the Allies poured into Germany and they saw the horror camps of the Nazis, Dachau and Belsen and Ravensbrück and all the rest of them, they brought the criminals, such as they could catch, to justice. And they convened the Nuremberg trial. Summing up for the British delegation at Nuremberg, Sir Hartley Shawcross described the atrocities that had been committed against the Jewish people in the pursuit of what Hitler called the final solution to the Jewish question. He described how human hair was baled for commercial purposes, how human fat was rendered into soap, how tattooed human skin was made into lampshades, how they extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses and melted it into ingots and shipped it to the Reich Bank. And he said mass murder had become a state industry with byproducts. And yet the Jews today are a greater force in this world than they've ever been before. They are a force to be reckoned with. There isn't an Arab country in the Middle East doesn't recognize that. There's not one of them wants to tangle with that little country again if they can possibly help it. And I tell you, as I study the entire prophetic picture, I have come to the conclusion that when the Soviet Union finally rolls its armies southward to attack Israel, it's going to get a mauling on the way before it finally gets across the frontiers. Jews aren't going to stand back second time and let it happen again. And they've got the technology to make Russia wish she hadn't started. And when they cross the frontiers, God's going to step in and finish the job. You know, the rebirth of the state of Israel is a very great miracle. When I was a lad of 18, I was drafted into the British Army and I was shipped out into the Middle East, and I was stationed for 2 years in what was in those days still known as Palestine. It was a mandated territory of the British Empire in those days. I had a Jew work for me in my office. He would never tell me about his past, but one day he did. Told me how all his family had been exterminated. His mother and his father, his brothers and his sisters, his aunts and his uncles and his cousins, and his neighbors and his friends. He was the sole surviving member of his family. Somehow he'd had enough sense to see it coming and had made his way to Palestine just before the British slammed the door. And I can remember him as he stood there that day in my office, and he was explaining to me how he, as a German Jew, like so many other European Jews, the thing he wanted more than anything else was to be assimilated. He wanted to be assimilated. And I can still hear him say, as he stood there that day in front of me in my office, and he told me how he was born in Germany and he spoke the German language and he went to German schools and he graduated from a German university and he worked for a German corporation. And he raised his hand and he said, "I was a German. Hitler taught me I was a Jew." He taught the entire Jewish population of the world the same thing. Here is a people that can't be assimilated, and they can't be exterminated. And my friend, now they've gone back to the promised land for the third time. The fig tree is putting forth its leaves. They went once from Egypt. That was the first time they went back to the promised land, and they gave the world the Bible. They went back again from Babylon, and in the process of time they gave the world Jesus. And now they've gone back for the third time, and they don't know it yet. Because Paul says blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. But they're getting ready to give the world the millennium. They've gone back now for the third time. And the fig tree is putting forth its leaves. It's an amazing thing when you stop to think of it, that a nation uprooted, scattered, buried in 100 countries, for hundreds upon hundreds of years, should suddenly come back to life in our generation. Something very significant about our generation. The fig tree's putting forth its leaves. Just think, for example, of the Hebrew language. It was a dead language in the days of Jesus. It wasn't the spoken language of Palestine. They spoke Aramaic. Hebrew was a language of the scholars. It was reserved for the reading of the scriptures. Now here's a language, you see, that had been dead for some 2,000 years that's come back to life again. That's an astonishing fact when you stop to think about it. It was the idea of a Jew by the name of Israel ben Yehuda. He was a Russian-born Jew. He was on his way to Palestine between the two world wars, and he announced to his Russian-born bride on board the ship as they were heading towards the coast of Palestine that he intended to speak to her only in Hebrew when they got there. And he was so impatient about it, he began to fulfill his pledge right then and there on the deck of the ship. He was a man with a single mind. He had only one a purpose for existing, that was to resurrect the dead Hebrew language. He wanted to have 12 children, one for each of the tribes of Israel. He had 11. He was absolutely furious. He told his kids that he had no use for them. that he had begotten them for one purpose only, that they might disseminate the Hebrew language. His children were the first children since the days of the Romans to be born into a home that was where only Hebrew was spoken. He used to send his kids out into the streets to pick fist fights with other Jewish kids in Hebrew. And in the end, he won. As Jews became increasingly nervous in the countries of their adoption and began to come back in ever-increasing numbers from ever more cities and countries in the world, they were speaking a babel of languages. They decided they had to have a common language. They had one in English, but they were getting fed up with the English. They decided at Ben Yehuda's insistence to resurrect the Hebrew language. Now here's a language been dead for 2,000 years. You know, language has a living entity to it. Anything you can find out for yourself. You see, if you've got an Oxford English dictionary, the kind I had when I was a kid in school, is absolutely useless today. There are no words in it for any of the modern concepts of the nuclear electronic age. Now here's a language been dead for 2,000 years. No word in it for anything in modern society. No word for automobile, no word for electricity, no word for train, no word for steamship, no word for spark plug, no word for anything. And so what did they do? They went back to the old Hebrew roots, because Hebrew is a root language, something you can find out for yourself by looking at the back of a Strong's Concordance. And they go back to these old Hebrew roots. And just to give a crude kind of an illustration, supposing they wanted a word for an automobile, they'd go back to the word for chariot, that old dead Hebrew root. And they'd add a little prefix to it or a suffix to it, and they'd coin a new word. And they went on doing that, you see, until all those old dead Hebrew roots had put forth their leaves. And a dead language came to life. It is an extraordinary thing. It says something about our generation. This is a very great mystery. It's a very great miracle. And my friend, it's also a very great message. Jesus said, watch the fig tree. When you see the fig tree putting forth its leaves, when you see that country which I cursed coming back to life again. He didn't say when you see it bringing forth fruit, when you see it bringing forth leaves. In other words, it would be in exactly the same condition that it was when he cursed it. Christ rejecting. And that's exactly what's happened. The nation of Israel has been reborn in unbelief. It is probably the most Christ-rejecting country on the face of the earth today. It's there. It's alive. It has all its national, economic, social, religious functions. It's got its leaves, but it doesn't have any fruit yet. And that's what Jesus said would happen. He foretold that just before his coming, the nation of Israel would be back in the land as a nation, in unbelief. And friends, we've seen it happen. Jesus said, these things, when you see these things begin to be, he said, this generation shall not pass till all these things begin to be. What generation? Well, obviously not the generation to which he was speaking. That's the generation you have in chapter 23 that he cursed. If it isn't the generation to which he was speaking, then surely it has to be the generation of which he was speaking. The generation that would witness the budding of the fig tree. And I submit to you, my friend, without any desire whatsoever to try to fix any dates at all. But I submit to you that that generation is our generation. And I refuse to throw out the baby with the bathwater just because some idiot set a date last year. Jesus is coming again, and we can confidently expect it'll be in our lifetime. I believe that everywhere you look in the Word of God and you test the prophetic waters, you'll see that things are happening, that our generation is a very remarkable generation. I was thinking about this some years ago, and the Lord showed me something rather interesting. Think what happened on the day of Pentecost. On the day of Pentecost, you had the nation of Israel in the land, Christ rejecting in unbelief. And then on the day of Pentecost, God supernaturally injected into history a new entity that is called the church. For one generation, you had Israel in the land in unbelief, carrying on all its national functions, and the church reaching out to the world. At the end of that generation, God said, I'm going to make a change. And he took the nation of Israel and uprooted it and scattered it, and left the church to carry on with its mission to the world. We have now arrived at the other end of history. And what do we have? We have the same thing. We have Israel in the land in unbelief, carrying on all its national functions, Christ rejecting. And you have the church still here, reaching out still to its vast worldwide constituency. But my friend, God is about to make a change. And as he injected the church supernaturally into history at the beginning of this historic era, he is now about to eject it supernaturally back out of history and leave the nation of Israel in the land alone to face the countdown to the return of Christ to reign. I say, my friends, we're living in marvelously exciting days. Did you ever play that game when you were a little kid? I remember playing it as a boy in Britain. I imagine you play it over here. You may not use the same kind of words that we use, but ours are right. We had it first. You remember playing that game, hide and seek? Like some poor dude was it. And everybody else ran away to hide, and he was supposed to count up to 100. If you're like me, you did it in tens. And everybody else ran away to hide, and you were counting up to 100, and when you got up to 100, you said, I'm coming, ready or not. I say, my friend, Jesus has almost reached 100. And he's saying, I'm coming, ready or not.